Okay, this isn't actually the, wait, hold on. Oh, I know, hold on. Stop it, okay. I'm gonna start from 1, and then we're gonna start again. Hi, everybody. No shit. That was my daughter, everybody. Hi, wow. Welcome to this talk. I'm super excited to be at DerbyCon. This is amazing. My name is Ian Coldwater, and I am doing a talk about Kubernetes security. And if you are not here to hear about Kubernetes security, you are in the wrong room. I have a speaker clicker in theory. One sec. Anybody have a speaker clicker, out of curiosity? I can just also hit the button. But if Encrypted has one, I'll take one in a minute. Hi, my name is Ian Coldwater, and I live in Minneapolis. I do DevSecOps at Jamf Software, which is a company that does mobile device management for Apple products. And mostly what I do there is I focus on hardening and sometimes breaking container and cloud infrastructure, particularly Kubernetes. I come from an offensive security background, but not necessarily professionally. I started hacking when I was 11, and kind of stuck with it for my whole life. And I don't know, it's fun for me. I do CTFs a lot. It's a thing. And because I came from that offensive security background, when I got to Jamf and they were having me secure stuff, what they said is like, okay, we're doing this, but can you break it? And it was like, okay, challenge accepted. So went about breaking it, learned some stuff, and that is what I'm here to tell you all about today. But before we do that, let's talk about containers and Kubernetes a little bit. One sec. Who here is familiar with containers as a concept? Oh, cool, most of you. Who here is familiar with Kubernetes? Still most of you. Okay, great. I'm going to explain it anyway for the few of you in the room who didn't raise your hand. This is a lovely box full of kittens. Okay, containers are not actually things. They are not actually boxes. They do not actually contain kittens, unfortunately. I know, right? A container is a process. It's controlled by C groups, and it's isolated by namespaces. It's basically like a lot of Linux things stapled together. They share the resources and other kernels with their host. You would want to have your application in a container if you have dependencies, if you have other kinds of pieces of your application that otherwise you would have to sort of spew all over your 1,000 Python package management folders. It allows you to put it all neatly in one place and to run it together. Containers are easily deployed and easily destroyed, and they're very convenient for microservices and different things that allow things that are small and stateless work well for. Containers have a bad rap for security, but it's kind of an unfair one. They can be very secure if set up and configured correctly. IBM Research recently came out with a study that says a Docker container with a well-crafted seccount profile, which blocks unexpected system calls, provides roughly equivalent security to a hypervisor. Whether it is set up properly is, of course, another question. So containers are cool, but they came with some issues. They're hard to scale. You can have your one application, but if all of a sudden everybody's hitting it at the same time, it's harder if you don't have an orchestration framework to be able to automate scaling it up, scaling it down, and deploying it in the most easily manageable way. So people came up with container orchestration frameworks, and Kubernetes ended up being the most popular. That mouthful of a sentence up there is the way that Kubernetes websites describes their project. So here are some things about Kubernetes. It's API-based. It's defined by YAML. It's huge. It is the second most active project on GitHub after the Linux kernel, which is not technically on GitHub. It had a huge rate of adoption. It's really caught on very fast. It has a huge rate of change. The development cadence is about 3 months, happens coincidentally to coincide with about every time I give this talk, in which point they deprecate a lot of things and break a lot. And it's kind of the new hotness. People are using it a lot. But the thing about Kubernetes is that it's really complex. It's not one thing. It's a sprawling ecosystem of things which can work together or not, be configured in different ways. Kubernetes is an open source project. It was started by Google in 2014, and it ended up being outsourced to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, who now run it as an open source project. And it's available open source, but it's also available commercially with projects like Red Hat OpenShift or Tectonic, things like that. You can run it in different ways. You can run it on different public clouds. The configuration can really vary a lot. And I'm saying all of this like, it's complicated things, because it is actually kind of complicated. It's really complex. It's hugely variant. You can completely lock it down, and you can also really easily screw it up. So. Newer Kubernetes releases, especially in the last year or so, have really stepped up their security features a lot, especially after 1.8. 1.12 is the one that just came out. That was when they really started to focus on security more as a thing. The thing is that before that, security really wasn't considered a thing at all. In 1.5 and below, there is no multi-tenancy. There is one user. That user is admin. Everybody can probably take a guess as to what kind of privileges that user has. Everything was just absolutely wide open by default in the beginning, and often it's still wide open by default. And there are reasons for this. Kubernetes is hard. As I said, it's complex, it's complicated. Users, a lot of the time, will have a hard time kind of getting started. There's a reason why the most popular book on Kubernetes is called Kubernetes Up and Running, because people really want to try to figure out how to get it up and running. And because of that learning curve, a lot of the time defaults stay wide open, even to this day, just so that the users can like get their thing going and get on with their day. The problem is that sometimes the users get their thing going, put it on prod, and get on with their day, and then it stays in prod forever. Who here's worked on a production server before? Most of you. Every single one of us knows, who has worked on one of those, that what happens in production stays in production, just hangs out there. So there's still a lot of older, really insecure default Kubernetes versions hanging out in the wild. And in terms of giving security advice, that can be complicated too, because the defaults can vary really widely. They vary across cloud providers, they vary across installers, they vary according to like your individual configuration, which could have any number of forms depending on what you're trying to do with it. And so being able to give one plain attack chain that like this is exactly how you attack any Kubernetes cluster that you're going to encounter, or alternatively being able to give advice about like this is exactly how you would secure every Kubernetes cluster you're going to encounter, is not, I'm not going to say it's impossible, because I guess nothing is impossible, but I don't know how to do it, because there's just so many different ways it could be. But let's talk about some things. A lot of the things around attack here, attack and defense are going to vary a lot, are going to be assuming older versions with open defaults or newer versions with the open defaults set to open. Newer versions that are well configured and well patched, a lot of this stuff is not going to be possible. But it's interesting, so I'm telling you about it anyway. And so all of this complexity, all of this complicatedness, and the ways that it can differ, it can make for kind of a clusterfuck. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation did a survey in fall 2017 asking people who were using Kubernetes what they found their top challenge to be. Security had the majority of answers, because securing stuff is really difficult. And that has real-world consequences, like Anybody who's ever seen any kind of thing on Kubernetes security has seen this story before, because it's the cautionary tale forever for things that can happen that are bad if you don't secure your Kubernetes cluster properly. Happened to Tesla, happened to Weight Watchers. They just had these open ports that didn't have any kind of authentication on them at all. And once people figured out what those port numbers were, then they were like, okay, cool. They went in, they had immediate backdoor access to the entire cluster, which can also get you access to, in some cases, clouds or hosts. And that stuff has been deprecated some in newer versions, but again, you can still find it. And it isn't just big companies that this happens to. B-Sides San Francisco in 2017 put on their CTF with a Kubernetes backend, and somebody who was playing, who presumably had more experience with the backend of Kubernetes than some of the people putting on the CTF, if one of those is you, I'm so sorry, and went into the backend of their API server, took all of their flags, handed all of the flags to the people putting on the CTF and said, we think that you should fix your API. So if you're having trouble with this, if you work with Kubernetes personally, it really isn't just you. This happens to all kinds of people. What's the worst that can happen? Access to credentials can lead to compromise of other accounts. Being able to escape a container can lead to a compromise of the host. This isn't a small deal. You really, if you are somebody who's trying to attack this, think of it as like, if you're an attacker, have you ever wanted to pop the domain controller? Any of you? None of you have wanted to pop the domain controller. Really? Okay, you have. Kubernetes is basically the domain controller. And so if you're an attacker, that's an interesting thing to try to attack, because it allows you the ability to be able to get things within the cluster as well as things outside of it. If you are a defender, if you leave your Kubernetes cluster open, people can just walk right in and take all the shit. Don't be that defender. Close up your cluster so that people can't. Kubernetes is interesting. It's not well understood. It's not well understood by anybody. And the thing about that is that that leaves us a lot of interesting opportunities to be able to do stuff with it. And Kubernetes has an interesting attack surface. As I said, it's complex. It's got a lot of moving parts. So let's talk about some of those moving parts. In Kubernetes, a group of containers is called a pod. They work closely together. They share a network namespace. A service is what gets exposed. It groups the pods together. Those pods together get a stable IP address. There is a master node, which includes the control plane and interacts with the kubelet, or with kubectl, and also with the worker node that dictates what happens with the clusters and containers that it's trying to run. Namespaces allow you to portion the hardware in your cluster out to different things without seeing each other or communicating, but only if you set them up correctly. If you don't set them up correctly, then things within the cluster can see each other and communicate. So let's talk about, like, if you're an attacker, what would a good goal for you be? The API server is going to be the best goal, because if you're looking at the arrows here, the API server communicates with the kubelet, it communicates with etcd, and it communicates with the other parts. And so if you're able to get to that, you're able to get to the other ones. Anyway, etcd is a key value store that saves all of the information about what's in the cluster in it. Historically, like until pretty recently, etcd in Kubernetes was stored in plain text. In some installations, it's still stored in plain text. And so if you have access to etcd as an attacker, you have access to all of the credentials, all of the cloud metadata, absolutely everything else in it. That's a pretty good goal for you as an attacker. As a defender, if you're a defender, you probably want to prevent people from being able to get access to that thing. Newer versions of etcd do have, they're not in plain text anymore, but older versions certainly still exist. I did a search on Shodan last night. They're definitely out there. In general, and the kubelet is a thing that communicates with the API server on that end and also communicates and dictates what happens in the container. The kubelet is how those really big splashy attacks that I put up a couple of slides ago happened. It is basically a backdoor into the cluster. It controls most of the things and is fairly easily accessible, especially in older versions or in incorrectly configured clusters now. In general, the Kubernetes threat model is like an external attacker coming from the outside, a compromised container or a compromised application within a container, or a compromised user credentials. Computers are dumb pipes. I think many of us know this, that if you have somebody's credentials, as far as the computer's concerned, you're that person. And so I'm putting those two together because basically they're very similar. The attack flow is fairly similar to an attack flow anywhere else. You can scan, you can enumerate what's on it, you get your initial foothold, maybe you download some tools, maybe you can privilege escalate laterally, and that's all within the cluster. So it's on the cluster level, but the flow is pretty similar. If you are a defender, you want to consider your threat model. Like, what exactly are you trying to do here? And the way that you would secure your Kubernetes clusters should be dictated by that model, because otherwise you're just going to make bad and strategic decisions. So a threat model, if anybody has not heard of that in here, is what are you trying to protect? Like, what assets are you trying to keep people from getting? Who are you trying to protect it from? Like, who are your adversaries? What are their capabilities? And what are your capabilities in trying to protect against them? And those things are, if you have a lot of really sensitive data in your cluster, you might want to be particularly concerned about locking down that data. If you have something that, depending on how you're doing your network, you might want to leave that open. It might make more sense for you to do that. You're going to know your own system better than I'm going to know it. But it is important to think about. And, my threat model isn't your threat model, but your threat model is okay. If you're trying to protect against random script kiddies, you might want to have a slightly different strategy than if you're trying to protect against nation states. And if you are trying to protect against nation states, you may be in deeper shit than your average fancy bear. So, consider your model and what to do with that accordingly. It's been said that defenders think in lists and attackers think in graphs. So let's talk about Kubernetes as a graph. Okay, so the attack flow, like those things connected in the control plane slide a little bit ago, connect to one another in ways that it makes sense to attack one and then move to the other. And in general, the attack flow in Kubernetes is going to look like this. You want to, if you're coming from the outside as opposed to targeting someone from specifically, you want to scan for open ports or exposed services. You want to know what's running as privileged, what's connected to what. Does it have wider internet access? Can you download stuff from it? Does it have write access to the container registry? Can you upload stuff back to it? Are there credentials or any secrets hanging out anywhere that you can access? Where can you go from there, like within the cluster or potentially outside of it? What can you control both inside and outside the container? So let's talk about starting there. Let's talk about discovery. Who here has heard of NetAssert? Any of you? Ooh, neat. NetAssert is basically Nmap for container structures. So it runs like Nmap. I think it even pipes Nmap out, but it allows you to do that within a cloud container context. So that is that's a thing you could use. You could throw regular Nmap on it too, if you wanted to. You're looking for open ports, exposed services, and there's you can you all know how to do it. You can find some of those things on Shodan. You can find some of them on GitHub. Sometimes you can find them by Google Dorking. You want to find the things that are open. And these might be some of the things you might be looking for. So externally visible ports that you could potentially scan or look for include the one for etcd, which historically that port, if it's open to the network, you could actually just go in and read it. So, all right, there's the creds, there's your cloud metadata, all right, move on with your day. That's not necessarily the case anymore, but again, I looked on Shodan for this last night. There's definitely ones that are still there that do that. 4194 is cAdvisor. cAdvisor, which the web UI got deprecated in 1.12, but the CLI version did not. cAdvisor gives you metrics about what's going on in your cluster. So it tells you, for example, all the services that are running, the versions of all the services that are running, what exact pods and things are on your cluster, whether they're healthy or not, metrics that might be useful for you as an operator or potentially useful as an attacker. The API server historically, again, was open. The API server to this day often does not actually require authentication. So if you can get into a cluster's API server and that one doesn't put auth on it, if it's running a very old version, then you actually just have access to the cluster. The insecure API server, which got deprecated a few versions ago, is, spoiler alert, insecure. It has, if I remember correctly, like just total access, and you can just wander on in there and you can do that. The kubelet 10250 is the one that people search for the kubelet exploit and the backdoors that I mentioned before. 10250 allows you to get write access to the kubelet as well as read access, and that actually, especially with older versions where the kubelet is unauthenticated, or even newer versions, because the kubelet by default accepts anonymous requests that are authenticated still. And to prevent it from doing that is a breaking change. So it's an ongoing debate within the Kubernetes project about what to do with that. So if you have access to that, default's unauthenticated, game over, you have basically root within the cluster. 10255, same thing, but it doesn't have write access. It's read-only, so you can see what's going on, but you can't necessarily control what's going on. 44134 is Helm Tiller. Has anybody heard of Helm or Tiller in here? Helm is like a kind of sort of deployment solution for Kubernetes. It's pretty comprehensive. Tiller is the package manager within that. Helm and Tiller in particular run with full privs. And because they run with full privs and because they actually don't work if they don't, they are they're allowed to get around pod security policies, role-based access control, and other things that allow you to lock the network and the cluster down if you're a defender. As an attacker, if you are able to get around those things, fantastic. You can pretty much go do whatever. And there are various other things that could be open for various network plugins. So if you're using Flannel or Calico or Weave or anything like that, those will have different things that you could search for too. This was the Shodan result some time ago. There are actually more now of open etcds. And there are a lot. I think as of last night, there were 2479. And there's a lot out there with some really amazing stuff on it, which I managed not to screenshot, which was kind of hard. So if you're a defender or if you're operating a cluster and you want to prevent people from discovering it, don't leave your ports open where people can find them. Make sure that if there are management ports that are visible externally, that they don't require authentication. And limit SSH access to Kubernetes nodes, because it's easy to brute force SSH access, and maybe if you don't need it, you don't need it. If you do need it, make sure to create an SSH bastion for it, and that will help segment it and prevent bad things from happening to the rest of your cluster. So if you're trying to enumerate, what are you trying to enumerate? You're looking for, as I said, cAdvisor. You are looking for plain text etcd, like things on there that are going to allow you to find the information that is being disclosed. Services that are running with privileges, such as Helm or Tiller or Kops, which is another kind of deployment strategy that people use. Kops also runs with full privileges and is wide open by default. cAdvisor and etcd can disclose information. They're defaults installed in most Kubernetes clusters. They're unauthenticated. Some of them actually still don't even have options for auth. Some of them are not planning to do options for auth on their roadmap. So those are things to look out for. How do you get in there? So let's talk about it. Authentication in etcd is not necessarily turned on by default. So if you happen to run into an etcd that isn't, you can just get into the etcd, in which case you have access to everything else, in which case you have your cluster. You can use the API server, and the API server, especially in older versions, because it's open by default like that, does allow you to just be able to control the cluster from there. And the kubelet, not every default, as I said, puts authentication on it. And so if you can get into the kubelet, that is a full backdoor to the cluster itself. You are able to have read access, you're able to have write access, and you're able to have admin access. You can do all of the things. And so that's generally speaking within the control plane. You could also compromise the cluster, or you could compromise a container within the cluster, you could compromise the user. But let's talk about that in a minute. This is the kubelet exploit. I'm just going to read it out to you because it's gorgeous. It's been largely patched, but again, older things still exist in the wild. Everybody who has access to the service kubelet port 10250, even without a certificate, can execute any command inside the container. That just means that basically anything else that you're trying to do to secure this container is completely useless. That's on GitHub. It's pretty cool. I recommend checking it out. So with the kubelet, you can read, you can write, you can dump log files, you can open and execute other privileges or privileged pods within the container, and you can run commands on the API to run the entire container. And you can also get service account tokens as part of the environment variables and things that are up there. And service account tokens by default in Kubernetes run all the things. So if you have them, especially in older ones where nothing's been locked down yet, you can, before 1.6, Kubernetes gave each container a token to communicate back to the API server, and those tokens were cluster admin. So if you could get access to that token, you have access to cluster admin, you could administrate the cluster. And you can go do whatever with it if you want to. But you don't necessarily need to do any of that. You could just do things like social engineering. And because, Kubernetes isn't super well understood. And so you can do things like have a helpful blog post explaining something that people don't really understand very well, such as a service mesh or something that is really sort of complex and hard. And you can be like, okay, download my lovely Docker image here, Docker run this, kubectl-f, this script.yaml. It's super helpful, it's hello world, it'll help you get up and running, this is gonna be fantastic. Well, if the person isn't paying attention and they're just running this thing without knowing what it does, then that can give you a backdoor to the cluster in and of itself. A lot of the time there can be sensitive information stored in environment variables, and those are very easy to get within Kubernetes. Like literally it's just get in. And if that's there, if the service account token's there, or any of that cloud metadata is there, you have it. Preventing user compromise, don't fall for social engineering. Tell your people not to fall for social engineering. You're not immune. If you think you're immune, you're not. Developers in particular, if any of y'all work with developers, tend to be extremely overconfident about whether or not they're targets. They also tend to have a lot of access to a lot of stuff. So maybe they have access to, the keys to the kingdom, the keys, the GitHub credentials, all of the things. And Salesforce did an internal survey a little while ago that said that developers were actually more likely to click on phishing links than marketing or sales. But they're not targets. It's fine. It's totally fine. So, compromising a dev or another user is one thing. Here is a lovely example of a Hello World Docker container. Don't build that. As far as I know, it's live. You can prevent credential compromise by keeping your credentials encrypted and not putting them out on plain text for all of Shodan to see. Limit access to them for people and parts of the cluster that don't need them, and handle your secrets safely. The new Kubernetes version introduces something called TLS Bootstrap, which allows you to bake certificate handling into the cluster when you make it. That used to be a really complicated, annoying process, and as of 1.12 with TLS Bootstrap, it isn't anymore. So how do you compromise a container? You can have a malicious app or malicious code within a container. If you have shell shock in a container, it works just the same as shell shock anywhere else. And so if you have vulnerabilities in code, if you have malware, if you have stuff that just hasn't been patched, a compromise elsewhere in the cluster, that can allow you to compromise the container, and that can increase the attack surface. So that can give you container or file system access. That can give you access to its internal position within the network, which if you're trying to compromise an internal network, can allow you to move around within it. And a cool thing about shared kernels is that it also makes for a shared kernel attack surface. And so if you have a container or a cluster with, with a vulnerable kernel in it, you can actually just get the whole thing from there. The container registry is also a thing. Docker Hub some time ago pulled down, or removed a bunch of images that had been fooled millions of times that contained crypto miners because they don't actually really pay that much attention to what's on their registry. And Docker Hub isn't the only registry out there. If it's private, if your developers are just putting whatever on it, who knows what's on there, it can stay on there. So that's a thing too. You can prevent container compromise by writing your own application securely if you're a developer. Don't run stuff if you don't know what it does. If you can run static code analysis on your apps to check for vulnerabilities. There are good open source tools for that, like Clairs by CoreOS. And if you find vulnerabilities, actually deal with them, because if you leave them there forever, then they stay there forever, and then you have a vulnerable container. So if you're in there, you've got your reverse shell, you've got your malicious container, what are you looking for? You are looking for sensitive information and environment variables. You're looking for what exists within kubectl and what you have access to. And in particular, if there's wider internet access, you can get kubectl. If it's not there already, you can download it. You can execute things with it. You want to see what kind of access control it has, because if it's after a certain version, it's going to have role-based access control on by default. But if people screw up configuring it, then you might have access anyway. So figuring out what kind of access to other pods, other nodes, things within the cluster, you want to figure that out. And you're looking for cloud metadata, which can exist. It can exist within etcd, it can exist within environment variables, it can exist within other parts of the cluster, and there are kube commands that you can run to be able to find those things. So you're looking for that, and you're trying to figure out where you're able to go and what you're allowed to do. And from there are various ways in Kubernetes to be able to escalate privileges. With older versions, it was you could have your shell in a malicious container. You could then call out to the API server, which at the time had, was unauthenticated, and you could run commands on it. You could then, from there, create a privileged pod, and you could, have privileges in that pod. Just move to that one, and then move around the cluster from there. There were a couple of CVEs that came out last year that were related to subpath host mount, and the patching of these made for breaking changes, which upset some people. So these things are still sometimes unpatched out there. But subpath host mount was a full host escape. It allowed you to, if you had a container that was running privileged, if you had root on that cluster, you could actually just have full read and write access to the file system on the host by creating a symlink and going from one to the other in that way, because it allowed the mounting of symlinks in a full way. And so that just allowed you to have root access on the host if people were configuring it that way, which is pretty cool. If you are operating a Kubernetes cluster and you want to prevent people from being able to escalate their privileges on there, you want to put on something called a pod security policy. Pod security policies can not allow things to run as root. They can prevent things from running privileged entirely. They are able to you can literally set allow privilege escalation to false. You can just make it so that people can't do it. And they can prevent different kinds of syscalls. You can do different things with it. And don't run your containers as root. It's a terrible idea. Don't allow mounts. Don't allow dangerous syscalls. If you don't need them, you probably don't. Just don't let them do that. You'll be in better shape. So how do you move laterally within the clusters? You can, again, if there's a service account token, that's going to have access to all of the things within the cluster, and you can just move from one pod to the other. If you have access to the API server or the kubelet, that also allows you to create and destroy pods and be able to move from point A to point B. In order to move outside of the cluster, you want to look for mount points, and you want to be able to, I'm gonna drink a sip of water for a second because I'm blanking. You're looking for mount points. You're looking for things that will allow you to escape the container. You're looking for namespaces that are not segmented properly, such because the way that Kubernetes and containers are made of namespaces, and because of the way that Linux treats namespaces in the sense that everything is a file, it is possible to be able to exploit namespaces by using the file system to get from like one point to the other. There are also ways to prevent people from being able to do that. There are things called admission controllers, which make it so that you actually just cannot get from point A to point B. It will be like, no, you are not allowed. And you can segment your networks and like limit communication to where necessary, so that if you're like, okay, get namespaces, get pods, get everything else in this cluster, it'll just be like, no. So if you put those things on, it's gonna make it a worse day for attackers. And I feel like I should mention persistence, because persistence is a thing that's important. And containers are stateless, and containers are ephemeral, and so persistence doesn't seem quite right as a term. But container registries, again, containers aren't actually deployed. The way that you deploy a container, because a container is not a thing, is you pull down images from the container registry. And if those images contain vulnerabilities, or reverse shells, or malware, or whatever else you want to throw in there, the containers pulled from them will contain them too. And they'll all contain them. As many times as they get destroyed, it'll continue until the image on the container registry gets fixed. Developers are able to push to container registries as well as pull from them. And so if many Kubernetes installations have the container registry on by default, or like write access to the container registry on by default, and they don't look and they don't fix it. And so if you're in there, it's worth looking to see if you have write access to the container registry, because if you do, then you put whatever kind of malicious payload you want on there, you put it up there, and then every time that the person who's on the other end of that is like, oh, this malware, it's terrible, it's the worst, I'm gonna destroy this container and make a new one, they're just gonna keep having it because it's on their registry until they go and fix it. So that's probably the closest thing that we have to persistence in this case. And you can break out of containers. It is a thing. The CVE numbers for the subpath host mount escapes, there were 2 of them, were CVE 2017-1002-101 and CVE 2017-100102. They're super interesting if you look up subpath host mount. I didn't end up having time to be able to explain them in great detail, but they're really cool, and it's worth looking into. And that is, that's the sort of splashiest, nastiest example of how you can do that. But I don't believe that all of the ways that people can do that have been discovered yet. And so there is a lot of interesting opportunity for you as an attacker to be able to discover new attack surfaces. And let's talk about clouds for a minute, because a thing about having access to cloud metadata, for example, within an environment variable, is that then I can get into your cloud account. And if I can get into your cloud account, then I can do things like spin up a coin minder on your infrastructure. And there are ways to limit resources on those things so that so that you probably won't know for a while that that's going on. So how do you keep your public cloud account secure? For one thing, don't throw your credentials in a visible way in your cluster if you have them. And generally be careful with your credentials. Don't throw them on GitHub. Don't have them on places where people can see them. And identity and access management within the cloud is going to be really important, because if your IAM is configured properly, whatever script kiddie rando who happens to find your thing on GitHub, who happens to wander into your cloud account, is going to have a much harder time creating new structures and new things to do. This is a list of controls, and basically it's just a list of words, because every single one of these is like a 2-hour-long talk that Kubernetes has in it to be able to lock down your networks and segment them. That's worth taking a picture of, and it's worth Googling all of those because they're important and they're pretty complex. TLDR, a lot of the advice for securing Kubernetes is like standard security advice. Practice defense in depth, like follow the principle of least privilege, be aware of your attack surface and your threat model, and like get your basics right. Don't leave your stuff open, don't leave it admin, the things that like you would think everybody would know, but we all know that everybody doesn't necessarily know. And for attackers, a lot of it is actually fairly standard too, in some ways, like, how do you privilege escalate through proc mount? If you're familiar with Linux and how to privilege escalate through it, a lot of that is going to look familiar to you. On the other hand, there are things within Kubernetes that are fairly unique to Kubernetes and cloud native stuff, which makes it really new and interesting and emerging, and there is that. Hackers should give a shit. Because Kubernetes is like, it's the new hotness. It's everywhere. It's not going away. And more and more infrastructure is being spun up on these things. Knowing how to attack it properly and knowing how to secure it properly is going to be really vital moving forward for people who are trying to do this stuff. So it's worth researching, it's worth looking into, and it's worth caring. It's also pretty cool. I don't know, I like emerging tech, and figuring out how to be on the bleeding edge of, how to break the thing, kind of fun. If you're into the other kind of thing, figuring out how to be on the bleeding edge of how to defend the thing can also be kind of fun. This is a big old resource slide, and you really should take a picture of this one because all of these are great. These are different talks that people have given, or in some cases link dumps, in some cases the CIS benchmarks are a 250-page PDF, I'm so sorry. The CIS benchmarks are really important, but also it's important to know that they're kind of like, they're a guideline. They're not something that you have to follow exactly, because if you follow them exactly, your cluster will fail. Like, they aren't actually set up to make it perfect. They're set up as like things to think about. So, but all of those are really good. Check out those links, they're really good. And it's worth looking into because it's worth doing the stuff right. And you got this. I believe in you. I think I don't have time for questions, but if you have questions for me, I'll be around DerbyCon for the rest of the con. Come find me, and if you are a woman and if you want to play the CTF, come hang out with me at 4 outside